welcome. And if I'm in the hot seat again, it can mean only one thing, and that is, yes, today I'm grading more poetry homework. And today's homework comes from a student that goes by the name of Bono, who has wrote a limerick, would you believe, about the war in Ukraine. And the great thing about limericks is that I have taught them in schools, and typically you will learn limericks in the UK in grades 5, 6, 7. So we're talking about students between the age of 10 and 12. So if a child of that age can get to grips with limericks, we would expect a child of Bono's age to also have a firm grasp of the conventions. Also, Bono is from Ireland, and doesn't limerick sound like something that would originate in Ireland? So surely he would only want to do his best for what you would assume would be national pride. So let's get into the poem. Oh, so it's an ode, not a limerick. Oh, St. Patrick. Oh, St. Patrick. Oh, St. This is not a great start. Typically, when you have a limerick, you will have 3, perhaps 4 stressed syllables on a line. And the lines, lines 1, 2, and 5 anyway. And typically you would have I think it's an anapaestic meter, which means da-da-dum, 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 da-da-dum. And what you have when you have O as the first syllable, the first word of a poem, is you typically have that like an ode. It's like, it sounds like you're going to begin with something kind of grand. You know, the chorus, Henry V does not walk out and go, oh, you know, it's, oh, for a muse of fire. If you see that there straight away, you're like, okay, so we're starting. Oh, St. Patrick, he drove out the snake. So we're starting with a stress, which is wrong. That's, we can get around this. We can, we cheat our poetry a little bit. So we were looking for da-da-dum, 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 da-da-dum. And so it'd be, oh, St. Patrick. Oh, St. Patrick, he drove out the snake. So it actually does fit if you sort of rein that O in. But the purpose of an O at the start of a poem is not to do that. So that's a little bit strange, but it's okay that it fits the meter and it works out okay. Oh, St. Patrick, he drove out the snakes with his prayers, but that's not all it takes. Da-da-da, da-da-da, da-da. Oh, it's almost like saint is a stressed syllable as well. Oh, St. Patrick. And Patrick is, that's almost wrong as well, because you're looking at that stress should be, oh, St. Patrick, which we kind of do say Patrick. There is that emphasis of volume, but in terms of a meter, you're looking at the length of the syllable rather than the stress by volume. So it would be, oh, St. Patrick. Oh, St. Patrick, he drove. It's not awful. The Saint and the O is like you're working against yourself a little bit. But Patrick, you have to almost, like you're almost pronouncing it wrong. It might work better if it was just, oh, Patrick, he drove out. Oh, Patrick, he drove out the snakes. It might work better, even though you're cutting an unstressed syllable out. You kind of can play fast and loose with the unstressed as much as you like, really. You can insert, you can cut away from, but you are looking at, as long as those stresses fall in the right place, your limerick will sound right. With his prayers, but that's not all it takes. So that's fine, it fits. For the snake symbolizes an evil that rises and hides in your heart. This hides in your heart as it breaks. I don't understand why that's not just a continuation of that line. One assumes that if you break a line, you're breaking a poetic convention, particularly something like a limerick, which is identifiable by its convention, that if you're breaking that, you're doing it for a reason, a specific reason. You want emphasis at that point. Otherwise, why would you do it? So, for the snake symbolizes an evil that rises and hides in your heart as it breaks. So firstly, those last 4 lines, which should be 3, are just awful. Just really, really awful. In terms of meter, for the snake symbolizes... For the snake symbolizes. So there's symbolizes. So it symbolizes, because otherwise that's like a double rhyme, isn't it? When it's 2 syllables going, which is fine. It's not completely out of the convention of rhyme, but for the snake symbolizes an evil that rises, and where's the stresses there? An evil that rise is you got a I'm embarrassing myself. I can't remember in the terms. I think that if you end on an unstressed, it's a feminine line, which is interesting to have that there, because the convention calls from a masculine. So it's like, okay, so what is the point? What's the point you're trying to make here? And I think that the point that I'm trying to make is that anyone that thinks that in a poem of all mediums, you need to understand, you need to explain so literally what your symbols mean, then you're not a poet. And in all likelihood ought to leave your poetry to the people that are, because for the snake symbolizes an evil that rises, it's like, you're not quite, the rhymes are like, yeah, they're okay, but don't explain what your symbols mean in a poem. The point of poetry is to work those symbols, to make your statements in a way that is poetic, not literal. And this is literal. And then it hides in your heart. So the emphasis there, otherwise you wouldn't have a break there, is that it's in your heart. But then it's like, that doesn't make any sense. Not any sense at all. Because the snake symbolizes evil that rises in your heart as it breaks. I think if your heart is capable of breaking when you're looking at the suffering in the Ukraine, you're showing empathy for the Ukraine, then that isn't a product of evil in your heart. So that literally explains its symbols, and it literally doesn't make any sense. It's absolute garbage. Also, I don't understand why that breaks there. That's just awful. Don't put a break in your poem. You know, if you're asked to write a poem at school and somebody says write a limerick, then don't. You need to show that you know how to write a limerick. So don't be breaking on lines. That's almost like an anti-caesura, like to break a line at that point. Like a caesura would be breaking, using punctuation to stop in the line, whereas that's like stopping to start a new line, but you really don't need to, didn't ought to be doing that. And if you are doing it, do it for a point. And if the point here is that the evil is rising in my heart as I empathize for the Ukraine, then your point is really, really stupid. Really, really stupid. And then it carries on, which means that this is not a limerick. This, you know, as I was saying, if you're set the task of writing a limerick at school, show you understand the limerick. 5 lines, rhyming scheme, A, B, B, A. Do not break those conventions. Those are the conventions that you're being asked to demonstrate. So if you're saying, oh, this is a limerick, and you don't do that, then in a school, the school's going to be like, this is not what we taught you. When you are out of school and you're writing limericks and you want to break conventions like this, then that's fine. Just not in your exams. And not for no reason at all. If you're breaking conventions, then you're breaking conventions to make a point, to show something emotional and clever, to show that you understand a convention and are breaking it deliberately. And I'm not sure that's the case here, because the point that it's making is so incredibly dumb that it makes me think that you don't understand the conventions either. Let's have a look. Assuming that this is not an extended, because if it is, it's, and hides in your heart as it breaks, and the evil has risen, my friends, which that's not an extended, because the rhyming scheme there would be A, B, B, A, C, which, again, if you're playing with conventions because you're smart, that's great, but if you're playing with conventions because you don't understand them, that's not. And the evil has risen, my friends. So it's not extended, it's a second limerick. And the evil has risen, my friends, from the darkness that lives in some men, and the evil has risen, my friend. So those your stresses are on E, riz, and fre. So not too bad. And the evil has risen, my friends. And the evil has risen, my friends, from the darkness that lives in some men. Only some men? No women? But in sorrow and fear, that's when saints can appear to drive out those old snakes once again. Okay. This is the trouble with meter, is that when it goes wrong, it gives you a headache. And it's going wrong here. So, and the evil has risen, my friends, from the darkness that lives in some men. But in sorrow and fear, that's when saints can appear to drive out those old snakes once. No, that just doesn't work. Drive is a stressed syllable. It's a longer syllable. I mean, you could, with a word like to, you can go to, but you can also shorten it to like to drive out. So it's fine. The to is fine, although almost like to, it sounds like it's stressed. But you can go to drive out those old snakes. And it's almost like every syllable there, apart from the first one, is stressed, which is just making it, and it just doesn't work. And you would think that anyone who had ever written words to try to put them to music would immediately know when something doesn't scan or not, and that doesn't scan. It's almost like drive. To drive out, these are single syllable words, but they really sound longer than a single syllable normally would, particularly if it was unstressed. So I think it's to drive out those old snakes once. I think all of them are stressed syllables. You can kind of cheat some, like we talked about to. So we go to drive out. So it's almost like to drive out. You're trying to shorten that drive. It's so difficult to shorten that to fit it. So if we stress that, then we can't stress out. But try saying out without stressing it. So it's to drive out those old snakes. Snake. It just doesn't work. So what we could do is we could take those, because those is a stress. It's just a long word. You can feel the length of it when you say to drive out those old snakes once again. That you can do in poetry. You've all seen it if you've seen Shakespeare. You put the apostrophe, you take something of the word out. And if we take that out and we could choose those old snakes to the old, to drive out the old snakes once, that starts to work then. To drive out the old snakes once. I think that once just scuppers everything. It is a stressed word. It's a stressed syllable. So you have to take that out. And it actually works fine without it. The sentence makes sense without it. To drive out those old snakes again. The once doesn't add anything, but it breaks the meter. So it's to drive out the old snakes again. But we'd have to say again, because we're trying to... Then we have to say again, because we're trying to rhyme with men, which doesn't really rhyme with friends either. You're supposed to be ending on a stress, so you want to say again. If you say again, you're de-stressing where you want to be stressing. It's unstressed where it wants to be stressed. It just does not work. It doesn't work at all. It's really, really awkward. To drive out the old snakes again works better than it does in its current form, which is awful. So the third limerick, because it carries on, but it doesn't rhyme. There's another 5 lines there, so it's 3 limericks, not 1. And they struggle for us to be free from the psycho in this human family. Ireland's sorrow and pain is now the Ukraine, and St. Patrick's name now Zelensky. And they struggle for us to be free from the psycho in this human family. That's just awful. That's really, really horrible. How could you write a limerick and not read it aloud and go, oh, that doesn't scan. I need to have a look at that. Because that's the point of a limerick. It's not the sole point. There are other points as well. But the fact that you have this fixed meter is what gives it the rhythm. It gives it that musicality. Without that, you don't have a limerick. And this is not a limerick. If it doesn't fit that, it's just, like I said, that there are 10-year-olds that can grasp this. To drive out, that's the previous one. So, and they struggle for us to be free from the psycho in this human family. So, like that's infantile. Is the only way I can describe that. The psycho in this human family. You should be. It's just, I don't know even know how to explain how much I hate that, but I hate that. But also, and they struggle for us to be free. Is that not quite literally the opposite of what's going on in the Ukraine? Because I'm assuming that when he says, and they struggle for us to be free, that he's talking about they being the Ukraine and us to be everyone that's not the Ukraine or Russia, the West, basically. I mean, this was written for the Democratic Convention or something like that in America. So he's talking about Ireland, America, or and perhaps including the UK and the rest of NATO or something like that. But perhaps the whole world would be better off without Putin is his point. But so the us is everyone apart from Russia and the Ukraine. But the Ukraine is not fighting for everyone else to be free of Putin. Ukraine is fighting because it's being invaded. So they are not struggling for us to be anything. They're just fighting for their survival. And that makes this bollocks, to be honest with you. It's just drivel. And they struggle for us to be free. It actually fits the meter okay. From the psycho in this human... From the psycho in this human... That just... The thing about a poem is that when you're writing a poem should be read aloud. You should read your poetry aloud, at least to yourself, to make sure, especially when you're writing to a meter, that it scans. But if you read a poem, any poem, aloud, and you literally can't read it aloud without going, what is going on there, then there's a real problem, real fundamental failure in your poetry. From the psycho in this human family. You feel that stress on free, how long that free, that sound at the end is. And you have to have that stress in family, which is not technically how we would pronounce it if we weren't reading poetry. But you have to have the stress. This is a limerick. The stressed patterns are an important part of it being a limerick. From the sigh, there's your stress. 2, that's anapaestic, I think. Da-da-dum. From the psycho in this human family. It doesn't work. The stresses are just a mess. Where from the psycho in this, why don't you just go from the psycho in this family? Because that does scan. You're an unstressed syllable short from the sigh. So you've got 3. It's 2 stressed and 1 stressed. 2 unstressed and 1 stressed. From the psycho in this family. Yeah, so it actually just fits if you go from the psycho in this family. That fits really quite nicely into the anapaestic beat, the meter, the amount of stresses that you should have on this line. It works with the one above it. It has that musicality that you expect, and they struggle for us to be free from the psycho in this human. No. The human is got the stress at the start. It's on the hue, so it's human. You can say human and put the stress on the end, but it sounds, contrived, which is okay a little bit, especially, if I'm in a class of 10 to 12-year-olds, I'm not going to worry about that if they're contriving a stress, as long as they understand where the stress is going to be. But if you just take out human, actually that line just scans It's like when your point overrides your understanding of melody, what you have is an aging rock band that used to be able to write a hit and now can't write one to save its life. Sorry, that got a bit meta there, didn't it? And they struggle for us to be free from the psycho in this family. Ireland's sorrow and pain is now the Ukraine, and St. Patrick's name is now Zelensky. The last line's awful as well. But Ireland's sorrow and pain is now the Ukraine. Do the Ukraine know that they're causing Ireland sorrow and pain? Because what he means now is, using the analogy of the snakes, is that Ireland's sorrow and pain is now in the Ukraine. Is now in the Ukraine. It actually fits the meter better if you put the word in there. Ireland's sorrow and pain is now in the Ukraine. That works better than what you've got here, which is saying effectively that the Ukraine is Ireland's sorrow and pain. Well, they ought to stop, didn't they? Stop hurting the Irish. Stop upsetting the Irish. If you think that I'm being a little bit silly, think about what would happen if you were with your girlfriend or boyfriend, husband or wife, even if you went up to your mum or dad or somebody and said, oh, by the way, you are my sorrow and pain. Do you think that they would take that as a compliment? Do they think that that would be like, oh, you're sharing with me? What a great moment we're having here. No, that's an insult. Why would you say that about the Ukraine? And on this line as well, we've got the same thing that we had with the first line, is that when you start a line of poetry with and, there is this tendency as you read it to stress that syllable. And that should be in a limerick an unstressed syllable to start the line. And Saint, and again, Saint feels like it should be a stressed syllable. So it'd be and St. Patrick name, and St. Patrick's name now. Whatever happened to the guy that wrote, a man will rise, a man will fall from the sheer face of love like a fly from a wall? That's poetry. Well, give it a fairly mediocre rock guitar riff underneath and it'll work. Whereas this, I think at this point I'm going to give up, because, and St. Patrick's name now, I don't know where the stresses would be on Zelensky. I don't do Ukrainian language at all. I'm the names with particularly when it's been anglicised through the change of alphabet anyway, are just going to be difficult. But here you have to go Zelensky, because otherwise it doesn't fit the stress pattern of da-da-dum, Zelensky, which means that now should be stressed but name shouldn't. And you try saying that, you have to kind of, so you've got Trick's name now, Zelensky, Trick's name now, and St. Patrick's name now. And shouldn't that be St. Patrick's names, apostrophe S, his name is now Zelensky. So you should have name apostrophe S to show that you've taken the I out. I find it confusing. I really do. What's confusing about it is that anyone with even the faintest understanding of meter, which if you've ever written a song, you've dealt with, how you could fail so utterly in the limerick. Meter is quite hard when you're sort of first starting in poetry. It's not easy to pick up the stresses, but you can, because we've grown up with nursery rhymes, which almost all have some sort of meter. Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall. You can hear the rhythm, the musicality. That's the meter. That's done by where syllables are stressed, where they're longer than the others, which are shortened. And It's the most fundamental part of fitting words to music, is to understand I need a number of syllables, then I need a pattern of them to form a melody. Yes, you go up and down the stave, but you also have to understand that you're creating a pattern, and that's what we have here, is a pattern. And if you don't have that, you don't have a limerick. And we're failing on too many of these to really go, you've got a good grasp of the limerick there, you've got a good grasp of meter, I'm giving you your pass. But the second thing about this that's the most important part of a limerick is that it's supposed to be funny, or at least cheeky, light-hearted. That's the purpose of limericks. And poetry, again, is all about subversion, to take a convention and turn it on its head to show that, one, that you understand it, and two, that you're playing with it, you're using it for your own message. And in that regard, to take something like a limerick that's supposed to be whimsical and nonsense, and to make it a serious statement about the situation in the Ukraine, would probably be commendable. It would be an interesting thing to do well, and see if you could pull it off. But I don't think that I don't think that there are too many circumstances here where you'd say that's been done well. It's 3 limericks, not 1. Not any of them is particularly good or clever. It's like the point of it is so on the nose that there's no subtlety, there's no artistry here. If you like in the first stanza, if you have to explain your symbolisms, or you feel you have to, then you almost don't understand the purpose of poetry itself, let alone a limerick. So from a year 10, 11 or 12, there's enough here to go, you know about a limerick, I'll give you your pass, but there are a few things you need to work on. From a grown man, an adult, I would just be like, don't try and write poetry. Oh, and definitely don't force your poetry into other people's phones against their wishes. Spin on that, Bono, you tosser. And everybody else, I hope you enjoyed this video. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.